You can't be serious." The voice, sharp and laced with the smug certainty of a young man convinced of his own brilliance, cut through the tense silence of the vast testing bay. Bryce Caldwell, lead civilian engineer on the Pentagon's multi-billion-dollar Griffin main battle tank program, stood with his arms crossed, a tablet computer clutched in one hand like a scepter. His eyes, narrowed with irritation, were fixed on the old man sitting quietly on a metal stool. "Major, I specifically requested the top diagnostician from General Dynamics, not—" He gestured dismissively at the man, who appeared to be in his late 70s, maybe early 80s. He wore simple denim jeans, a worn flannel shirt, and scuffed work boots. His hands, gnarled with age and cross-hatched with faint silvery scars, rested peacefully on his knees. He hadn't said a word, his gaze fixed on the monolithic engine prototype squatting in the center of the room, a silent trillion-dollar paperweight. "We have a Tier 1 national security asset dead on the floor, and you bring me a janitor." Bryce's voice rose, echoing in the cavernous space. The old man, Arthur Vance, didn't flinch. His pale blue eyes, which seemed to hold the quiet patience of a geological feature, simply scanned the complex latticework of conduits, heat sinks, and composite armor surrounding the Griffin's power plant. He was listening, but not to Bryce. He was listening to the silence, to the story the dead machine was trying to tell. The air around him was still, a pocket of calm in a storm of escalating frustration. Major Isabella Rossi, the uniformed program manager, stood a few feet away, her expression a careful mask of neutrality. "Bryce, this is the specialist the Department of the Army sent over. Let's just—" The Department of the Army sent him to do what? Dust the turbine blades? A few of the younger engineers in Bryce's team snickered. They were all clad in matching black polo shirts with the project logo, a stark contrast to the old man's analog appearance. They were a pack, and their leader had just singled out a threat, or at least an object of ridicule. Bryce took a step closer to Arthur, his voice dropping to a theatrical, condescending whisper. "Sir, I don't know who you are or what VFW hall you wandered out of, but this is a restricted, classified development area. We're dealing with a hybrid electric turbine that has more processing power than the entire 1990s internet. The problem is in the code, or a microcontroller. It's a digital problem. It requires a digital mind." He tapped his own temple. "So, with all due respect, I think you're in the wrong place." Arthur Vance slowly turned his head, his gaze finally meeting Bryce's. There was no anger in his eyes, no defensiveness, just a placid, unnerving stillness. He was an ancient turtle regarding a frantic sparrow. He took in the arrogant posture, the expensive watch, the faint sheen of stress sweat on the young man's brow. The silence stretched. The snickering from the junior engineers died out, replaced by an awkward shuffling of feet. Bryce's bravado began to curdle into discomfort under the old man's unblinking stare. He had expected a sputtering defense, an indignant retort. He had expected to win a quick public victory. He was not prepared for this profound, impenetrable calm. "My name," the old man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble like stones turning over in a slow river, "is Arthur Vance. The major invited me." Bryce scoffed, recovering his footing. "Fine, Arthur Vance. Are you even cleared for this facility? I need to see your credentials. A common access card, a security badge, something." He snapped his fingers at one of the security guards standing by the bay doors. "Jenkins, get over here. I want this man's credentials verified. If he doesn't have them, I want him escorted off this base." The guard, a stout man with a weary expression, ambled over. "Sir, Major Rossi signed him in. His clearance is—" "I don't care what the major did." Bryce cut him off, his face flushing. The pressure was getting to him. For 3 days, the $100 million engine prototype had been inert. Every diagnostic they ran came back clean. Every sensor registered green, yet it wouldn't start. It wouldn't even spool. The generals in Washington were calling every hour. His career, his reputation was tethered to this silent beast of metal and wires. And this old man was a distraction, an insult to his expertise. Arthur, without a word, reached into the back pocket of his jeans and pulled out a simple worn leather wallet, held together by a fraying rubber band. He carefully extracted an old laminated ID card. It was a retired military identification, the photo showing a much younger man with the same steady eyes, but with a sharp jaw and dark hair. Bryce snatched the card from his hand. He stared at it, a smirk spreading across his face. "Retired, Master Sergeant, Ordnance Corps." He read it aloud as if it were a punchline. "You were a mechanic. That's fantastic. The Army's top expert on a 21st-century quantum logic engine is a retired motor pool sergeant from the—what is this? The Bronze Age." He tossed the card back onto Arthur's lap. The disrespect was so blatant, so sharp it sucked the air out of the room. Major Rossi took a half step forward, her jaw tightening, but she held her position. This was Bryce's show, and he was determined to see it through to its disastrous conclusion. "Look," Bryce said, turning to address the gathered engineers, now a crowd of about 20. "This is what happens when bureaucracy gets involved. They don't understand the problem, so they just throw whatever they have at it. They look at a sheet that says engine trouble, and they send an engine guy. It doesn't matter that his experience is with carbureted Jeeps and diesel deuce-and-a-halfs. It's a box-checking exercise for some paper pusher at the Pentagon." He turned back to Arthur, his voice dripping with false pity. "It's not your fault, old-timer. You're just out of your depth, in over your head. This isn't about spark plugs and oil filters anymore." He pointed at the massive engine. "That machine is smarter than every person in this room. Its problem is a ghost in its shell, a whisper in the code. You can't fix a whisper with a wrench." As he said the word wrench, he gestured to a dusty, grease-stained leather tool roll that Arthur had placed on the floor beside his stool. It looked ancient, the leather cracked and dark, the brass buckles green with age. It was a relic, as out of place in this sterile, high-tech laboratory as a steam locomotive. The image of that worn tool roll triggered a flicker, a memory sharp and vivid as a lightning strike in Arthur's mind. It wasn't just a collection of tools, it was a testament. The dust of the Korean peninsula was a fine, gritty powder that got into everything. It was in his mouth, his eyes, the action of his rifle. A younger Arthur Vance, barely 20 years old, knelt beside the sputtering engine of a Patton tank. It was dying, and with it the hopes of the platoon it was supposed to be supporting. His hands were raw, his knuckles bloody. Standing over him was his mentor, Sergeant Frank Miller, a man who seemed to be carved from hickory wood and engine grease. Frank wasn't looking at the engine. He was watching Arthur's frustrated movements. He held out a leather tool roll, identical to the one on the floor of the Griffin testing bay. "Stop fighting it, kid," Frank had said, his voice a low rasp. "You're trying to force it to work. You need to listen to it. Let it tell you what's wrong." He pushed the roll into Arthur's hands. The leather was supple and warm. "These aren't just tools. They're listening devices. They'll teach you to hear the machine's secrets. They'll never lie to you." The memory was gone in a flash, but the weight of the tool roll, the ghost of Frank's words, settled back over Arthur, reinforcing his profound calm. He looked at Bryce, a man who only knew how to shout, and felt a quiet, deep sadness for him. Meanwhile, Major Rossi had seen enough. While Bryce was grandstanding, she had been observing, not just the engineer but the entire scene. She saw the flickers of doubt in the eyes of some of the older technicians. She saw the embarrassed looks they shared when Bryce wasn't looking. Most importantly, she saw Arthur Vance's unshakable composure. She had her orders, and one of them was to trust the man the Pentagon had sent. The other, unspoken, was to manage her prima donna lead engineer. Bryce had just made it clear that he was unmanageable. Excusing herself with a quiet word to one of the guards, she walked to a small glass-walled office at the edge of the bay. She pulled her secure cell phone from her pocket, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. She didn't call base security. She didn't call the General Dynamics liaison. She dialed a direct line to the Pentagon, to a 4-star general who commanded the entire Army Material Command. "Red Dragon, this is Griffin 6, she said, her voice low and urgent using the call signs. "Sir, I'm on site with the package." A moment of silence as the voice on the other end responded. "Yes, sir. Mr. Vance is here," she continued. "The situation is unprofessional. Caldwell is actively obstructing him. He's treating him with extreme disrespect in front of the entire engineering team." Another pause. "No, sir. Mr. Vance hasn't been allowed to even approach the asset. Caldwell is questioning his clearance and is in the process of having him removed from the facility." She listened intently, her back straight as a ramrod. "Yes, sir. I see. Understood. I will clear the immediate area and await your assets. Griffin 6, out." She ended the call, a new cold resolve in her eyes. The cavalry had been summoned. Justice was no longer a matter of if, but when. She stepped out of the office and stood by the main bay doors, watching the drama unfold, knowing that Bryce Caldwell was, at that very moment, ending his own career in the most spectacular way imaginable. The scene cut across the country to an office deep within the E-ring of the Pentagon. General Marcus McTavish, a man whose stern face was a fixture on Capitol Hill defense briefings, slammed his secure phone down into its cradle. The force of it made his aide, a young captain, jump. "Captain," McTavish barked, his voice a low thunder that promised swift and terrible retribution. "Get me the Secretary of Defense's senior military advisor." Then get me the CEO of General Dynamics on my other line. I don't care if he's in a meeting with God, you interrupt him. Sir, the captain asked, scrambling for a notepad. The Griffin prototype is down at Aberdeen, the general bit out, pacing behind his vast mahogany desk. Our lead civilian engineer, a child named Bryce Caldwell, is about to have a man forcibly ejected from the facility. He stopped and leaned over the desk, his knuckles white. The man he is ejecting is Arthur Vance. The captain's eyes widened slightly. The name wasn't common knowledge, but in certain circles at this level it was whispered with a kind of reverence. Yes, McTavish confirmed, seeing the recognition. The Arthur Vance, the man who jury-rigged a new turbine intake for an M1 Abrams in the middle of a sandstorm in Desert Storm, using nothing but a bent C-wrench and an empty can of pears. The man who holds a Medal of Honor for crawling under a burning tank while under enemy fire to manually disengage a faulty transmission, saving the entire crew. The man whose classified designs are in every engine system we've fielded for the last 40 years. Tell the CEO of General Dynamics that his multi-billion-dollar program, which his team of PhDs can't fix, is about to be saved by the man his lead engineer thinks is a janitor, and that I expect a full report on this unprofessional circus on my desk by 0800 tomorrow. Back at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, Bryce Caldwell was blissfully unaware of the storm brewing hundreds of miles away. He was riding the high of his own perceived authority, preparing to deliver the final crushing blow. "Security," he yelled, his voice now full of righteous power. Jenkins and another guard had approached, looking deeply uncomfortable. "I want this man escorted from the premises immediately. He is a security risk and is obstructing a vital national defense project. Get his name and information, and I want him barred from this base and every other federal facility in the tri-state area. Is that understood?" He turned his back on the guards and fixed his gaze on Arthur, who had yet to move from his stool. "Your little visit is over, old-timer," Bryce said, his voice dripping with finality. "Go back to whatever VFW hall you crawled out of. The adults have work to do." It was his last fatal overreach. It was the moment the universe had been waiting for to snap back. Just as the guard named Jenkins opened his mouth to reluctantly speak to Arthur, the ground began to vibrate. A low, powerful thrumming sound grew rapidly, and the massive 50-foot-wide bay doors began to roll upwards with a deafening groan. Blinding sunlight flooded the cavernous space, silhouetting 3 vehicles that were pulling to a screeching halt just inside. In the lead was a black command Suburban, its grille glinting. Flanking it were 2 military police Humvees, their red and blue lights flashing silently, painting the stunned faces of the engineers in strokes of garish color. The doors of the Suburban flew open. Major Rossi stepped out of the passenger side. From the driver's side emerged a man with the silver eagles of a full-bird colonel on his collar. He was the base commander, Colonel Davies, a man Bryce had only ever seen in official briefings. 2 armed MPs, clad in tactical gear, disembarked from the Humvees and took up positions by the entrance. The entire scene had the clipped, terrifying efficiency of a raid. Bryce's jaw went slack. He stared, utterly bewildered, as Colonel Davies and Major Rossi strode past him without a single glance, their boots echoing on the concrete floor. They didn't stop until they were standing directly in front of the old man on the stool. Arthur Vance looked up, then slowly, with the deliberate grace of age, he pushed himself to his feet. Colonel Davies stopped precisely 3 feet from him. He drew himself up to his full height, his back ramrod straight. In the ringing silence, he brought his hand up in a salute so sharp, so perfect it seemed to slice the air. It was a gesture of profound, absolute respect. "Mr. Vance," the colonel's voice boomed crisp and clear. "Colonel Davies, base commander, Aberdeen Proving Ground. It is an honor to have you on my installation, sir." A collective gasp went through the crowd of engineers. Bryce's face, which had been flushed with anger, turned a ghastly, waxy white. He looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. The world had just inverted its axis, and he was on the wrong side of the sky. Major Rossi stepped forward, turning to face the dumbfounded assembly of technicians and engineers. Her voice was steady and loud, a formal declaration for all to hear. "For those of you who are unaware," she began, her eyes sweeping over the crowd before landing, like twin daggers on Bryce, "the man you see before you is Master Sergeant Arthur Vance, retired. But that title does not begin to tell his story. Mr. Vance is a recipient of the Medal of Honor for actions taken during the Tet Offensive. He is the holder of 3 Distinguished Service Crosses and is credited with more than 24 patented, and 4 times that many classified, innovations in military vehicle propulsion and survivability." She paused, letting the weight of the words sink in. The silence in the bay was now one of pure, unadulterated shock. "He is known in certain circles as the ghost in the machine, because he has an intuitive understanding of mechanics that has been described by 4-star generals as a national strategic asset. When your 64-core diagnostic computers and your terabytes of sensor data failed to find the problem with the Griffin engine, the Secretary of the Army himself put in one call to this man. He was not sent here by a bureaucracy. He was sent here as a last resort. He is the most qualified person on this planet to be in this room right now, and he was brought here to save this program from your collective failure. Each word was a hammer blow, dismantling Bryce Caldwell's world brick by brick. The crowd no longer looked at Arthur as a frail old man. They looked at him as if he were a monument. They saw the worn clothes not as a sign of poverty, but of a man who had nothing left to prove. They saw the quietness not as weakness, but as the deep, still confidence of a master. Colonel Davies finally lowered his salute and turned to Bryce. His face was a mask of cold fury. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl, "your arrogance and unprofessional conduct have been a disgrace to this project, to the United States Army, and to every uniformed service member who relies on the equipment we build here. You mistake age for irrelevance and quiet dignity for weakness. You will tender your formal, personal apology to Mr. Vance immediately. Then you will report to my office at 1400 hours. Your position as lead engineer on the Griffin project is under immediate and permanent review." Bryce stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish out of water. Humiliation, hot and total, washed over him. He looked at Arthur, at the living legend he had just tried to have thrown out like trash. But before he could stammer out an apology, Arthur raised a hand, a simple, placating gesture. He placed it gently on the colonel's rigid forearm. "That's enough, Colonel," he said, his voice still that same quiet rumble. "The boy is under pressure. Fear makes people loud." He then looked directly at Bryce, and for the first time, Bryce saw not just calmness but a deep, flowing well of wisdom. "Son," Arthur said, his voice kind, "this machine, it doesn't care about your degrees. It doesn't care about your job title or how smart you think you are. It only cares about the truth. It's telling you exactly what's wrong with it. You just have to be quiet enough to hear it. Pride. Pride is the loudest sound in any workshop. Drowns out everything else." As he spoke, Arthur knelt down, his old knees cracking like tree branches. He unfurled the ancient leather tool roll. Inside, nestled in worn, custom-cut slots, was a set of pristine, old-fashioned steel tools, wrenches, calipers, gauges, each one polished to a mirror shine from a lifetime of careful use. The sight of the opened roll triggered the second echo, the completion of the memory. The Korean air was cold and thin. Sergeant Frank Miller was lying on a stretcher, a bloody field dressing on his chest. He was dying. He pressed the tool roll into young Arthur's hands, his grip surprisingly strong. "Listen to the machine, Art," he gasped, his breath hitching. "Not the noise, not the men yelling, not the fear, just the machine. It'll never lie to you. Now go get her running." Arthur had nodded, tears freezing on his cheeks, and turned back to the silent, waiting engine. Arthur picked up a simple, long-handled steel wrench. He walked over to the monolithic Griffin engine, the crowd parting before him like the Red Sea. He ignored the complex diagnostic ports and the glowing LED panels. He laid a hand on the cold metal casing, closing his eyes for a moment. He was listening. Then, with a practiced ease, he reached deep into a recess near the primary turbine shaft, a place no one had bothered to look, and fitted the wrench onto a large bolt. He gave it a firm, steady turn, a quarter turn, no more, no less. It moved with a slight, almost imperceptible groan. He then stepped back and nodded to Major Rossi. "Try it now, Major." Major Rossi relayed the command into her radio. In the control booth, a nervous technician toggled a switch. For a second, nothing happened. Then a low whine began to build, escalating smoothly into a deep, powerful hum, and then a deafening, triumphant roar. The Griffin engine screamed to life, its internal lights glowing with a healthy, vibrant energy. The floor vibrated with billions of dollars of controlled, ferocious power. The room erupted in stunned applause and shouts of disbelief. Arthur Vance simply stood there, wiping his hands on a rag from his back pocket. The problem hadn't been in the code or a microchip. It was a simple harmonic imbalance, a support bolt that had been torqued a fraction too tight at the factory, causing a microscopic vibration that put the engine's self-preservation sensors into a deadlock. It was a problem no computer could find, but one that a man who had spent 60 years listening to the secret language of machines could feel in his bones. The fallout was swift and decisive. Bryce Caldwell was not fired, but his demotion was immediate and public. He was reassigned to a junior diagnostic team on a legacy project, a move designed to teach him a lesson in humility from the ground up. In his place, Major Rossi appointed one of the older, quieter technicians whom Bryce had often ignored, and at the Aberdeen Proving Ground, and soon at every major R&D facility in the Army's network, a new mandatory training module was introduced for all project leads. It was officially called the Interdisciplinary Respect Protocol, but everyone on the inside called it the Vance Protocol. It was a simple course on the dangers of intellectual arrogance and the value of experience. Arthur Vance, having refused any formal payment, was driven back to the small, tidy house he'd lived in for 50 years. His work was done. A few weeks later, Bryce was sitting in the base cafeteria, pushing some listless-looking mashed potatoes around his plate. He looked up and saw Arthur Vance sitting alone at a corner table, calmly drinking a cup of coffee and reading a newspaper. His heart hammered in his chest. He knew what he had to do. Taking a deep breath, he walked over to the table. Arthur looked up, his pale eyes showing no sign of animosity. He simply waited. "Mr. Vance," Bryce began, his voice barely a whisper. I'm working on the old Paladin howitzer's hydraulic system. There's a pressure leak we can't trace. The schematics say it's impossible, but the gauges say otherwise." He wasn't apologizing with words. He was apologizing with a question. He was admitting his own fallibility. He was asking for help. A slow smile spread across Arthur Vance's weathered face. He folded his newspaper and set it aside. Then he patted the empty chair beside him. "Pull up a seat, son," he said. "Let's talk about it. If this story of unassuming valor moved you, show your support by liking and sharing. And don't forget to subscribe to Veteran Valor Stories for more tales of heroes who walk among us."